I'm delighted to be here today with Josh Tiessen, who is an artist, and I'll be talking with him in just a couple of minutes. And I want to hear his story, and hopefully we'll talk about the overlap between art and science and symbolism. So I wanted to start by showing you a trailer that he put together for an exhibit that he did, because I think it will explain a lot of things rather quickly. And I found it very enjoyable, so I'm going to share it with you now.
My painting series Vanitas and Veritas explores two divergent perspectives on wisdom and how we might flourish in a society filled with facts but mired in confusion. The Vanitas paintings include a character named Kohelet, which is Hebrew for teacher. Inspired by the Jewish wisdom book of Ecclesiastes, these works represent the human striving for power and pleasure, wealth and knowledge. The Vanitas genre, popularized by Dutch 17th century still life, is based on the opening line of Ecclesiastes, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." In these works, you'll notice that there's often skulls and moths and ephemera to remind the viewers that all of life is temporal. The Veritas paintings feature Sophia, the female personification of wisdom from the book of Proverbs. She espouses virtues such as humility, simplicity, and wonder, all vital for cultivating ecological wisdom. The Latin expression veritas can be roughly translated to holy greening or vitality, and it was coined by the nature mystic Hildegard of Bingen. Both Kohelet and Sophia are complemented by animal companions. While Kohelet is disenchanted with the natural world, Sophia seeks to learn from the symphony of creation, heeding the advice from the ancient sage Job. But ask the animals, and they will teach you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature. Over the course of 3 years, I spent about 5,000 hours creating these 23 new works. They'll all debut at my solo exhibition at Ray's Contemporary Gallery in New York City on April 28th.
So that is his trailer, and I'm eager to introduce you to Josh Tiessen. I'm delighted to be here today with Josh Tiessen, who is an artist and very interested in symbolic nature of things, because his work is very symbolic, and I'm really interested in talking with Josh. So hello, welcome to the Meaning Code, Josh.
Hi, Karen.
And I'd kind of like to get started with you telling, I started the whole video with the trailer of one of your recent shows, so people kind of know that you're an artist and the kind of work that you do. And I thought it would be fun to get started with your life, like where and how you grew up and what your childhood was like and what might have drawn you to art, and kind of talk about the basis of your symbolic worldview.
Definitely. So, as you might know, I was born in Moscow, Russia, to Canadian parents who were professors there. And from a young age, I did lots of arts and crafts with my Russian nanny, who was very keen, holding up my stuffed animals and teaching me how to draw them with shading and perspective. And when my family returned home to Canada, later when I was 9 years old, a local hobbyist artist, a pet portrait wildlife artist, took me under her wing and started passing on to me her skills in chalk pastel realism. And from there, she booked me for my first art exhibition when I was only 11 years old.
Oh my goodness.
My mom thought that was crazy. I mean, my parents don't come from an artistic background. So that was very foreign to them. They would have not have thought of doing something like that, and even pricing my work. And the first strangers started purchasing my art. And from there, I continued exhibiting. I had a solo exhibition at a public gallery museum when I was 14. and then studied under a famous Canadian wildlife artist, Robert Bateman, the following year, and then went full time with my work at 16 years old when I graduated from high school.
Wow. So how would you say that having that trajectory so early in life affected your development and your view of the world and so forth? I mean, did you feel at all pressured to go in that direction, or was it just like the world opened up to you and it was all joy?
Sure. So my parents were always very affirming for both my brother and me to pursue our interests, what we have been gifted and talented in. And I was interested in other things as well, like photography and graphic design, and even played sports like basketball. So my parents were really keen on making sure that we were well-rounded. I went to a private school initially in Canada, but then I got so bogged down by all the assignments and extracurriculars that I actually had very little time to work on my art from grades 1 to 3. And it was only when my family, because of resuming their life of travel with their work, that we began homeschooling, and that enabled me to have like the time and flexibility to develop
Mhm.
my work at a younger age. And so my parents encouraged it, but then it was other mentors that came along the way that saw that raw talent and exposed it further.
So I'm assuming you were born after 1990.
Yes. So my parents, my dad's ordained reverend, and my parents had uh, graduated from seminary and had their eyes on Russia. They were actually invited by the Russian church because there was a greater openness to religious groups
Mhm.
coming into the country, because there have been that communist stranglehold, and a lot
Uh-huh.
of people were then open after the Iron Curtain fell. Uh, my parents, along with a team of 40 other colleagues, went to teach at the Bible College Seminary, training young pastors, and so there was an openness, and my dad was a leader of this team, people working in youth camps and drug and alcohol rehab, humanitarian work as
Mhm.
well. And so I was born in 95 into this new world being reborn at that time. And so it was a very interesting time to live in Russia, because there was this huge shift and transition from
Mhm.
the previous era to the new era, which at that time um, promised a lot of hope.
Now, you were how old when you came back to the United States?
To Canada, I
I mean,
I
to
was
Canada, sorry.
6 years old. Yes, that's
Six.
that's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
6 years old in 2001. So although I do have lots of memories from Russia, I think I do still retain that Russian soul that the Russians identified in me. So I think I still carry that to this day. But I did grow up primarily in Canada, and did travel quite a bit throughout with my parents' lifestyle.
Well, so that's interesting. You said Russian soul. So how would you characterize that?
Yeah, so now that I'm in my 20s, I've gone back to reinvestigate what that meant specifically by reading some of their poetry and the great novelists Dostoevsky and Leo Tolstoy. And also, even when I see the art, whether that be the Russian Orthodox icons, or even the Impressionist painters, Ivan Kramskoy's painting of the Temptation of Christ in the Desert. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that painting, but it really reflects the real, like, sorrowful and the gravitas that's in a lot of their work. It's not superficial or glib.
Mhm.
They have a long sorrowful history, but there's a lot of beauty as well. I mean, We would go to the circus, and they would have a full orchestra playing, and we would go to the ballet, because my Russian nanny's daughters were ballerinas, and everything was done with such excellence, just to the utter perfection. And so in my work, which is hyperrealism, it's very much about pushing myself to the nth degree. So I think all of those things have shaped me in a way that, although my parents were Canadian, that upbringing, that nurture, that culture made an impression on me at a young age.
Well, you mentioned icons, and one of the things we've talked about quite a bit on this channel is the idea that with an idol, your gaze stops at the idol, but with an icon, your gaze goes beyond to
Definitely, yeah.
see what is represented there. And that's really what I see when I look at your work, that you've attempted to create work that allows the viewer to enter into it and then go beyond and then see the deeper, farther meanings of it. So maybe this would be a
Yes,
good time to
that's right.
talk about your really the nature of the symbolism that you use
Sure.
and what the
Definitely,
basis of that might be.
be happy to. And icons, of course, are called windows to the divine. And
Mhm.
in studying theology in my undergraduate degree, I really appreciated diving into church history and theology, and the iconoclastic controversy, where there were debates in early church history of whether icons uh, should be allowed to be worshipped, or should they be venerated. And I'm glad that people like St. John of Damascus won out his views that no, they're to be venerated, but they're portals. They are conduits to the divine. It's not the object in itself, which is the end that we worship. And even though that I don't personally come from a or Orthodox background myself, I have an appreciation for that clarification. Back to your question of how the symbolic world came into play with my work. In the early years, I was involved in the Canadian wildlife art scene, and I was juried into some of the top guilds, like the Society of Animal Artists in the US and Artists for Conservation. And I still very much appreciate these artists, and appreciate the technical accuracy of anatomy, and valuing the intrinsic worth and integrity of the natural world. But I also see that there's symbolic and allegorical depth to that. And so it was in my teens that I really wanted to bring these two things together, where I was very interested in scripture, for instance, because it talks about creation longs for restoration and longing, and how there's a brokenness in the natural world. And I think in a sort of a disenchanted worldview, where the sciences can often be culpable of, we could do wildlife art just for the sake of, I don't know, reproducing nature. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. And I celebrate that. But I wanted to do work that had more of the philosophical and theological elements at play. And so eventually I began my first painting series, Streams in the Wasteland, which used animals and nature's reclamation, but it also had these broader themes of kind of my enchanted worldview, for the lack of a better word.
So Streams in the Wasteland, you turned into a book. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, Streams in the Wasteland. Initially, I began without any promise for a solo exhibition. And I was very fortunate, after working on these paintings for several years, that I won a competition that a New York gallery was hosting, Jonathan Levine Gallery. And upon winning first place out of 2,000 artists, I then presented this body of work in my first international solo exhibition in 2019. And then the second half of the series, part two, was shown in a gallery in Los Angeles. But I thought I write stories to go alongside my paintings. So these are like artist statements. They're not exhaustive interpretations, but I thought, well, I have all this text and I've studied the book of Isaiah, where a lot of the inspiration comes from for the series. And I thought, why not put together a coffee table book? So this is it here. And there's 17 paintings in the series of nature reclaiming old abandoned civilizations and basically honoring the creator through living out their biological design to contrast humanity's unfaithfulness. So that was the theme.
And where is it available?
So it's available through my website at joshtiessen.com and also on Amazon. And I did book signings in local bookstores as well, but all the information's on my website for where it's available.
It looks like a beautiful book, and it's really exciting to hear that you used narrative to kind of enhance the work or to further maybe reveal some aspects of the work.
That's right. Yes, and I mean the style of my work now, which I've come to refer it, is called narrative hyper surrealism. So it's hyper realism,
Wow.
very
Okay.
detailed, but I like the surrealism tradition, which is it's very symbolic and narrative driven as well, but it delves deeper than just the physical realm. And I think the power story is so important, especially right now that a lot of the paintings in the series highlighted the ecological crisis, and a lot of times the way political pundits or scientists address this issue is just throwing facts at people, but that often has a negative effect where people push back. And the power of story and images is that it plays on our emotions and affections. And that's where I think the power of story brings people in to a world and can shape their loves. And we care for what we love. And so that's really important with the message of my work.
Well, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is the kind of coalescence of habit, memory, and pattern, how they kind of all line up in the same place. And I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago and heard John Vervaeke. He's a cognitive neuroscientist from Canada, Ontario, I believe. And he was talking about a term that they use in their field, anamnesis. Have you heard that term?
No, I haven't.
Well, the idea of anamnesis is that kind of feeling that you get when you arrive at a thought or you get to a place where you've never been before, and yet somehow it feels like home, or it feels like you've gotten to where you're supposed to be, but it's you had no way of knowing that was going to be there, and yet when you got there, that was the place. And I think about these things a lot because I've been contemplating very much the work of a developmental biologist by the name of Michael Levin, who works with cells. And I kind of have this idea that everything scales. If it's true in one field, it's true in another field, because I also really look to the scriptures as being real. And so Michael Levin is doing all these things with cells. And one of the questions that he had when he was working with them is, how is it that when the undifferentiated cells are beginning to build a body part, that they know when to stop? And then I heard this word anamnesis, and I thought, there's probably something like that at the cell level, that when they arrive at this place, there's a built-in memory of somehow having been at that place before. So when you're talking about the ecological paintings that you're doing and the emotional response there, it occurred to me that what you're doing is drawing out this anamnesis for the garden, because we all have this longing to get back to the garden, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it reminds me of some psychological studies which I've written about, which is that they've taken two groups of people, and one study group was in San Francisco in an urban environment, and the other group was in Yosemite. And they asked them through a survey at the end what their relationship was to transcendence and the divine. And they found that the people in Yosemite had a greater awareness of their smallness, their humility, and that there was something larger and beyond themselves than the
Mhm.
people in San Francisco that had a more inflated view of humanity. And so I think when we become reacquainted with the natural world, I think there is this realignment to this cosmic order that's on offer. And this was very much the theme of my work Vanitas and Veritas, which was about wisdom and how wisdom is this cosmic blueprint that we can align ourselves with or go against. It's been said when you go against the grain of the universe, you get splinters. H. Farmer, and I think that's such a great quote, because today we're, I think, as a society, suffering from a lot of moral splinters.
Yeah, that's a great quote. I mean, I've heard it said a lot of different ways. I also like the way Jordan Peterson says it. You can't twist the fabric of reality without it having springing back on you.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, maybe you said you had a PowerPoint slide
Sure.
presentation that you
Let
could do to
me,
show us some of your work.
yes. Yeah, let me I have it in order from the beginning. Okay, great. Let me go full screen here. So these were some of my early paintings, and I'll get to the newer ones. But as I mentioned, this was done when I was 14 years old, and so it was very early on, but had a great appreciation for the natural world and for the beauty and the diversity and particularity of creation. But early on, even in this painting, Pond's Edge, you notice there's this abandoned fishing boat that I saw. And so I became interested in not just representing pristine nature, because in our Anthropocene age that we're living in, there's much more of a clash between the human world and the natural world. And I also, like I was mentioning, creation longing for restoration. This passage in the book of Romans, the New Testament of the Bible. So I was still painting in acrylics at this time, and I had a real interest in textures, but not simply what was beautiful in the natural world, but also what like this is an old tree root on a beach in British Columbia that I thought would be really interesting, as it's sort of gnarled and looks kind of like it's groaning, so to speak. And
Your
then
your
yeah,
your light, the way that you
thank
use light is just extraordinary.
thank you. That's
It's that light that it's like you're seeing through a filter almost. And light is like that when the light is very intense, you get that. Or like in my daughter's a photographer too, and what she calls the
okay.
golden hour, there's a time
Yes,
of
I
day
love golden hour. Yes.
when there's this, it's almost like a mistiness, and yet the light has this intensity. It's very beautiful.
Sure. Yes, yeah. It's the last hour before sunset, and um in the morning, at dawn, the first hour. And so yeah, there's this twilight glow, and what I really like is how it highlights textures, and
Mhm.
whether it be even waves splashing. And it reminds me a lot of chiaroscuro, which you may be familiar with. It's
Mhm.
Rembrandt lighting that it's very dramatic and moody. And from early on, that was a real interest in me, and still continues to be. Light can kind of make or break a painting,
You
really.
also have a wonderful touch with color harmony. Do you have a secret? Do you use a mother color, or do you do
Let's see.
glazing or?
Um, Yeah, limiting my color palette is very important, and that's why I draw inspiration from impressionists. I love Vincent van Gogh and their ability to on the one hand represent nature, but also be intentional about the color palette. So there is often complementaries at play. I'm trying to think like uh, I make sure before I begin each painting to pre-mix all the paints. So I have tubes that come empty, and I pre-mix the color and then store it in the tube. And then so for each painting, I have maybe about 20 to 30 tubes of paint. And so that really helps me stay focused, because I think when you limit the color palette, it unifies the composition. And so even though you can have a painting that's highly detailed and complex, the color is what um, brings clarity to the composition.
Well, so when you're mixing your paints, are you using a set of cool primaries and warm primaries and then white, or
So
are you
no,
using just one temperature?
so I mean that there is the traditional atelier method, which would be like setting your palette up with maybe 8, 9, 10 colors. With mine, I'm doing it like digitally first on the computer by selecting color swatches, and then I'm matching that from paints that have already been mixed. Sometimes I have mixed from pigments, but just for the sake of time and efficiency, I don't mix all my colors starting from the primary colors. But
That's super interesting that you're using a digital method. That's so even
yeah,
when you were 14 and you were doing these works, you were doing it that way.
yes, yeah, it's
Yeah,
early,
that's the
early
modern
on.
world, man.
Yes, try to think if I could. Oh, I should have included one of the images of my mock-ups, but so yeah, this is, another painting. I usually would go and photograph the subject matter. So in this case, this was based on an old farmhouse window on my uncle's farm out in Saskatchewan. But I found that I changed the colors slightly. So you'll notice like in the wallpaper, which is like circa 1940s or 50s, you have those pinks, those kind of
Mhm.
orangey pinks. And then so that was reflected in the sunset. And then also with the green carragana bushes, reflect the color of the wallpaper. And so whether that was naturally the real colors, it was close to that. But I do try to make sure that a painting does have a balance between cool and warm tones. So back to your question,
Mhm.
um, here's another painting, Behold a Door, which was also from that the same farmhouse, but outside. And you can see how you have those like navy blues, but then that rusty red doorknob, which I thought, balanced out the color.
One of the interesting things that I think has happened in our disenchanted world is a sort of a recovery of the appreciation of the beauty of things like this old door.
Yes.
You know, you can paint it and it just evokes all those feelings. And then the home designers like Joanna Gaines and
Yes.
these other people, they see the beauty in those old doors and they capture them and they don't scrub it all off and make it fancy again. You know, they take that door the way it is, maybe break off some of the chips a little bit, but put some new glass in there. But basically, you can live with that door because it's a reminder of the past and it's a reminder of beautiful things.
That's yeah, exactly. And like yeah, the shabby chic or the
Mhm.
rustic
Yeah.
decor has become quite popular.
Well, some of it though is
I
faked.
like,
You know, I don't really
yes,
like the
yeah.
shabby chic that's faked, but the stuff that's the real thing, which
No,
I mean, and that door
definitely.
represents reality almost more than even being there would be. You know, the beauty of the reality of that door is more prescient right in that painting than it would be if you were standing there looking at the door. So
Yes,
that's one of the advantages of art.
Exactly. Yes, like this painting is similar. I became very interested in peeling paint and the weathering effects of nature on human-made structures. And I was fascinated in like the abstract shapes that peeling paint creates over time and how things can be seen to be beautiful, even things that are broken that people would often look past. And I thought it could also have like a metaphoric value for how as humans we create things that we think are so strong, and there's this arrogance that we can um dominate nature and control it. But when we see something like an old farmhouse, I think it has a humbling effect. And that's where in my work I often include peeling paint, even to this day, both for the aesthetic interest, but also because I think it carries a greater weight. This painting specifically, Behold the Door, was a reflection on symbolic of the human life, the door of our soul, and how we are weathered by the wrongs of others and our own wrongdoing as well, that we can be cracked and broken. And you know, for me with my faith, the story behind the painting is that there is hope, that there is someone, you know, namely the person of Christ, who looks past those flaws and can redeem and restore us. And so this was painted, I believe, when I was 15 years old. And so at a young age, I became interested in kind of these larger themes and communicating through the work. Whether or not people necessarily grab a hold on to those meanings, I still, nevertheless, that was important to me to convey.
Well, and doors have so many deep symbolic
Mhm.
meanings, right? And this
Yes.
painting here fascinates me because, you know, we have this whole thing with perception that one of the things I play with a lot in my work is, in order to get a kind of opponent processing going on so that I have something to push against, I create a lot of chaos on the canvas first, and then I
Hmm.
step back and I look to see what I might perceive in the chaos, and then that becomes the image that I start to try to draw out.
Yes.
But when you first flashed this up on the screen, the first time you put it up, it took me probably a couple of seconds at least for it to frame up in my mind, oh, that's what it is. Because at first I was, you know, the square and then the circle
Yes.
that's on its
The
side.
hoop.
That's what got me
Yeah.
first. So
Mm-hmm.
all the shapes and you know, I had a teacher once who said that what you see first is value. And that's exactly what happened here. I
That's
saw
right.
the
Yeah.
dark against the light. And then it took me a while for the whole thing to take shape. And oh, that's a basketball backboard, right? And
Yeah,
it
that's
wasn't until just
right.
now, just this instant, that I saw the bird. So what
Yes.
you've done here is you've created something that allows that perceptual process to kind of travel a journey until we find that that little bit of nature right there.
Yes, you have the goldfinch on the rim. This was defending the paint, and
I love
he's
your titles. They're just genius.
oh yeah, a little bit of humor
And
thrown in
just
it.
now I saw the shadow of the bird.
Yes,
I didn't
yeah.
see that at first. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, shadows are really important in my work, and they're kind of this reflection. I think you always need to show the darkness and the shadows to contrast
Mm,
the light. And
yeah.
you know, that's obviously a metaphor for life, too, the good and the bad. But it's interesting your point of like seeing the chaos initially with all the cracked paint, because you know, I see a lot of patterns and abstract patterns with the peeling paint, but it can
Yep.
very much look chaotic. But I like that contrast where you, like you said, you have that bit of nature, you have that goldfinch, and so that's you know, been a major theme in my work, and yeah, let's see
Well,
what
hold on
else I
just
have
one
here.
more second
Yes.
here, because one of
What?
the other things that I see going on
Mhm.
here, one of the things I think is really important in art, and that you see everywhere that you look in the world of science, is non-identical repetition. And so
Mhm.
in the peeling
Yes.
paint chips, you see lots and lots of non-identical repetition, which if that's all it was, it would just be almost like a wallpaper pattern. But then you have
Yes.
this very surprising element that's using the same tonal quality in the shadow over there, which is obviously something that is different than this non-identical repetition of all these paint chips. And so that little thing over there in the left-hand corner is what makes the whole painting. I mean, to me, it's what really brings the meaning into the whole thing, is that shadow. It's
Hmm.
very striking. I really like it.
Oh, thank you
Yeah.
very much. Yeah, that's a very interesting
And it's
comment.
also complementary color to the bird.
That's right.
So that
Yes.
so you're
You have
you're
the
playing
yellow and
with
the
the
purplish blue.
relationship between the bird and the shadow, and
Hmm.
sort of what's centered in between them. There's maybe that's where the meaning lies, is in the place between those two things.
But yes, yes, that's right. Yeah, they do very much balance out one another, and I often place my subject matter off center. It's usually whether that be rule of thirds or the
Yep.
golden ratio.
Hmm.
That's where the usually you would place in wildlife paintings, you'd place the animal entering the composition. But I like similar to artists, right, like Robert Bateman, placing the animal on the front edge, so to speak, almost leaving the composition, because it also incorporates this feeling of a fleeting moment that's being caught, that this goldfinch is looking out of the frame, which also adds an element of mystery.
Nice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Beautiful work.
great. Let's see. Okay, so um, this painting also incorporates peeling paint, Dark Night of the Soul, and this was very much an existential type of painting. I was very inspired by Caspar David Friedrich, if you're familiar
Mhm.
with his
Yes.
work,
Uh-huh.
and Wander Above the Sea of Fog is one of my favorite paintings of his. And this painting, although painted many years after his, also draws on nature as sublime, but also the soul represented by this shipwrecked vessel, and how often in my own life I was going through a period of doubt and struggle, and how Nietzsche has said that often when we're philosophizing, it's like we're looking into the abyss, and if we look too long, the abyss starts staring back at us. And it was a reminder to me to look to the light, and that's where the lighthouse is, illuminating the scene, but that choice that we have. And Dark Night of the Soul is this contemplative tradition from Saint John of the Cross, which believes that at times God withdraws from us to feel the emptiness of our lives, and how that can be paradoxical in the moment, but that it can, in the end, create in us a greater desire um, to return in communion after a certain period of time. And so that was it can be, the emptying process can be really beneficial in dealing with a lot of struggles and issues in our lives. And so this painting was very instrumental in my early development.
So you titled the book Streams in the Wasteland, and
Hmm.
I mean it calls to mind another book to me, but I'm wondering, where did you get the title?
Okay, so let me continue. So this was one of the early Streams in the Wasteland paintings. And so Streams in the Wasteland comes from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 43, which talks about the words of God: the wild animals honor me, the jackals and the owls, because I provide water in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. Yet you have not wearied yourselves for me, Israel. And there's this contrast of the provision of God being accepted as a gift by the wild animals, but yet the waywardness of the people of Israel that turn their back on God. And so this metaphor of streams in the wasteland is like the provision, this new life. The Hebrew people were in exile, and so there was this symbol of the wasteland. But then I was also interested in how the wasteland in light of modern 20th century life with a poem by T.S. Eliot, which you might be familiar with, called The Wasteland, which is very much about the decline of the church, but modern secular life. And this was at a time in his period before he had, I believe, converted to Anglicanism. I think he was an agnostic or atheist at the time, but he was really struggling with the modern wasteland. And so as you see, like in this painting here of Waleham, you have an abandoned church cathedral from London, England, where it was bombed after World War II. And so that's symbolic of the wasteland. But I've rambled enough on that.
Oh no, this is all just, it's all excellent. And when you had the image up of the shipwrecked vessel and the dark night of the soul, and I was reflecting on the title, Streams in the Wasteland, because there was a book that was very instrumental in my own growth as a Christian early on. I had been a missionary in Japan and then had come back in some very difficult circumstances after my husband left me there.
Wow.
And there was a book written by the wife of the founder of the mission organization that I was with, and it's called Streams in the Desert. It's the exact same verse in Isaiah, but I think it's just a different translation of Wasteland.
Yes.
And she had written that book when he was dying of a very long, protracted illness. And it's just a devotional. It's now been translated into 50 languages and 50 million copies have been sold or something like that.
Yeah.
But each day has just a very deep and profound little devotional. And one of the days talked about this woman who was really going through a dark night of the soul. And other people kept asking her, how is it that you can stay faithful when you're going through so much sorrow and pain? Wow. And she said, because it felt to her like God had withdrawn from her. And she said, I just keep looking to where he was the last time I saw him.
Wow.
And that was like so meaningful to me, because when things get really hard and dark, that's the hope that we have, is to remember where we last saw him and to keep looking in his direction.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know your story, but it's very similar to my parents, actually, because they were in Russia as missionaries. Of course, there's sometimes baggage with the term missionary, so I'm careful who to say that to, but weren't colonial missionaries. That's a rabbit trail. Sorry.
I know that the past has been so corrupted by current language that it's a sorrowful thing. Yeah.
So they were in their prime and doing the Lord's work, and then in Russia contracted Lyme disease, and as a result, when we returned home to Canada, our family was going to return overseas, but unfortunately the Lyme disease was missed and became chronic. My parents had to stop working, and they've been stuck in Canada ever since and haven't been able to go overseas or work full time. And so that was a real challenge for me, because you think like, where's the justice in that? These people who are doing humanitarian selfless work, and they get that taken away from them, that meaningful life that frankly, like I loved growing up overseas. And so there were some very, very dark years through this time that my art was developing, and it was very exciting. And so there was some hope and joy in that. And in some ways, it was a blessing in disguise, because if we hadn't been granted in Canada, I don't believe my art would have developed, because I was able to have the time and opportunities here in North America to become a professional fine artist by 16. But nevertheless, it has been very hard watching my parents suffer, and because we all as a family were around the guard dog in Russia that had ticks in its fur that carried the Lyme disease. My brother and I were also affected by Lyme disease, and we have symptoms as well. And so I've had to really wrestle with suffering, and how to rectify that, reconcile that with a good God. And it sounds like you've also had to wrestle with that yourself.
Yes, yes. And there's, yeah, I mean, maybe we should have an entire episode where we just talk about suffering, because
Yeah.
I think there's another really big idea that revolves around obstacles.
Mm.
The word that Jordan Peterson uses for it is anomaly.
Mm.
And I think anomaly is very important to the structure of the universe. And so I think there's this kind of coalescence of suffering, love, and anomaly. And the way that it kind of unites is in this pattern of growth. So when a parent is raising a child, you cannot try to protect the child from every single harm, because if you do, they will never grow. In the same way that when a butterfly is struggling to get out of a chrysalis, if you help it, you've doomed that
Mhm.
butterfly, right, to
That's right.
a
Yes.
non-life.
Yes.
And so there is suffering that comes at us that is of our own making. There's suffering that comes at us as a result of the sin of others. And there's suffering that comes at us just because the earth has peculiarities like Lyme disease. I mean, who
Mhm.
knows where Lyme disease came from, but probably has something to do with the corruption of the earth that
Yeah,
somehow
it's
came
an
out of the fall.
imbalance of an
Yeah,
ecosystem. There's
yeah,
proliferation of ticks. Yeah. Mhm.
yep. So, yeah, it's a longer conversation, but when you've had many, I would say this probably sounds strange, but when you've had many opportunities to go through suffering,
Hmm.
you really get a new perspective on how the world comports itself and on the goodness of God, because
Mhm.
the first time I learned that was when I first went to Japan as a missionary. I got a phone call that my brother had died in a plane crash,
Oh, wow.
and that was just the beginning of the difficulty of that situation,
Oh,
spread out in
that's
many directions. So,
tragic.
but the thing I finally came to through that process of sorrow and struggle and trying to, and it might very well be because I was in the constraints of being a missionary and had committed myself to that, kind of like marriage. When the tough times come, if divorce is not an option, then you look for the answers in the darkness. And so because I was committed to the missionary enterprise and we'd only been there a few months, I had to find my way through and hold on to my faith. And the only thing that helped me at that point was to come to a conclusion that God is good, and that was going to be my lifeline from then on to anything. And it really does reorient the way that you think about the world.
It does.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And I think there's obviously many opportunities and benefits that can come about through developing character and perseverance and how we are shaped. And I think there can be great healing that comes about through our wounds, but it's often we don't get those breakthroughs. We don't often um, look up and ask the deeper questions, bigger questions of life without suffering. And in every religion and philosophy of the world, it's something that has to be grappled with and wrestled with. I mean, if from a secular materialist perspective, it could be just seen, well, it has to be just deemed as random, pitiless indifference, this universe that we live, and there's no rhyme or reason why suffering exists. So we really shouldn't feel like it's an injustice. But we do have this inner sense of what wholeness should look like, and that we live in a broken world. And although I'm not going to glibly say that I have all the answers that faith gives me, that my faith gives me, but that there's resources within scripture itself for lament. And like, for instance, like the story of Job and many of the Jewish Psalms, that over I believe, is it a third or two-thirds? I believe it's two-thirds that are laments. And why, oh God, have you forsaken me? And that's Jesus's cry of dereliction from the cross, of feeling abandoned by the Father. And that's something that I appreciate is something that is grappled with in a robust way within Christianity, and that ultimately I have the hope of full restoration and healing in the new creation, in the new heavens and the earth. Otherwise, we don't have any justice that's brought to our suffering if we just live in a materialistic world and universe. And so I think in my work, I've really tried to reflect brokenness through remnants of human civilization. And so that was very much like the theme of Streams in the Wasteland, where you see these abandoned ghost towns from the West, or old cathedrals that have been ruined. And I think it's a reminder that the human civilization is fraught with suffering. But I see
This
a
is
lot of
amazing. I'm sorry, I just have to
thank
say it's
you.
amazing.
Thank you. And so I try to see the beauty that breaks through the cracks with nature. And so that's very symbolic. You might be familiar with kintsugi, well, coming
Yes.
from Japan,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
uh, and this Japanese practice of broken tea bowls, and how they are repaired with golden lacquer, this glue that brings them together. And so I was recently just speaking at a conference on nature's reclamation. I presented a short paper on nature's reclamation as a form of kintsugi, where nature, in a way, when it reclaims these old remnants, is in a way kind of like the gold that mends these broken pieces. And in a way, we often think of weeds as negative things that we want to get rid of, but something like this, where it's an old Greek temple with all this ivy, and even like a sandhill crane. I see beauty in nature, reclaiming these remnants.
Well, it's just so beautiful how you've replace the idol with
Yeah.
this beautiful representation of life, you know.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah,
beautiful. And
that's
it
right.
puts me in mind when I lived in Japan, I think this happened while I was there. It might have happened before I got there and people were still talking about it, but there was one of these temples where there was a giant idol outside the temple. And
Mhm.
some years before, the head had fallen off and they had done a massive reconstruction process to put the head back on again. And then either while I was there or just before I got there, it had happened again and the head of this idol had fallen off. And it reminded me of there's a passage of scripture where that happens to some idol.
Uh, yes. Well,
That Dagon,
there's
is it
the
Dagon? I think it's
yes.
Dagon whose head keeps falling off.
Yeah.
And here's the
Um,
head down at the base of the pillar, right?
that's right. Yes. Yeah, and that was, interesting because just trying to remember. Yeah. In Isaiah chapter 46, it talks about the beasts of burden that carry these idols, and it's also very humorous. There's quite a bit of irony because of course, like the Jewish people were commanded not to make idols, and it was very much because like obviously how can something physical like this little piece of wood or Asherah pole or Dagon or Baal statue, how can that contain the divine? Like it's just I think there's this passage like the idol carver makes this idol, and the one half he uses to build a statue, then the other half he burns in the fire to make his supper for coals. And so yeah, there's this I think irony here because you see like this is Zeus who's been toppled, and the Greek pantheon of gods was very like anthropocentric, and nature had a very low view in that sort of cosmogony, that worldview. And so this was my way of showing this sandhill crane, um, showing kind of the futility of the Greek gods, how people once believed in them, but very shortly they passed away and no longer have any hold or sway among most people.
So what is the text across the top?
That's the Republic.
Oh, the Republic. Okay. Yeah, there was parts of it I couldn't read, but okay.
Yes, yes. And so that was also alluding to Plato's Republic and
Mhm.
Platonic worldview, which sees the world, nature itself as a shadow and something to be escaped for the spiritual world. And my work very much pushes back against dualism or the Gnostic spirit matter distinction, which often devalues physical matter. And I see an intrinsic value in the natural world. And so that's something I try to that's a driving inspiration behind my work.
So it sounds as though in your homeschooling that you had opportunity to study the classics.
To some extent, although it was something that I really studied more in college when I took many liberal arts classes and in philosophy. Um, my my homeschooling was broad as well. We studied, world religions and various, fictional works, but it was, I'd say, probably more in college that I studied philosophy and theology, and so tried to grapple. And so is interesting because a lot of my professors allowed me to write papers related to the arts, and that had a direct influence on my thinking and the artist statement behind my work.
Yeah, that's the symbolism of this piece is really interesting too.
Yeah, yeah. Liberation of the Jackalope was kind of a quirky painting of Jackrabbit, and I found out that although the jackalope is a legend, it's based in the truth that often jackrabbits develop this papillomavirus, where they develop these horn-like growths on their head, and you see in the shadow that it looks more like a jackalope, and it was this uh, concept where you see this jackrabbit who's shed his antlers, which the one is on the table there, and you see this kind of liberation of this fallen state, this broken state, and kind of symbolic of healing, where with this new dawn light lighting up the table and the sand and china.
Yeah, it's
Now let's see what else
and
I
I
have here.
there's such a
Yeah,
stability to the rabbit. It's really interesting.
thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, so I a few more here, but more of the paintings um, can be seen in the book and on my website. This is the Academy, which was showing how you know that academia can get so inflated. That monkeys, primates, these gibbons uh reflect kind of the moral based desires, and how there's so much chaos in the academic world on university campuses, and this was actually inspired by a local university, McMaster, which just so happened to be the place that Jordan Peterson, when he was presenting a lecture, and he got basically like chased out of the lecture hall by these crazy activist students with bullhorns, and there's viral videos on YouTube, if you haven't seen it. But I was thinking about how the animals can kind of confront human arrogance of some of these disciplines that get so inflated. So that was
Yeah.
the idea
Well,
behind
the
that one.
thing that's so
Yeah.
interesting to me is you tell the story, but at the same time, you've created so much beauty to be the
Yes.
backdrop to the story. That's, yeah, I love that.
That's true. I mean, I think there's beauty. Like, this was an abandoned ballroom in Toronto, and I have these two meerkats perched up on this sofa, and it looks like they've taken over. And I like how this verse, in First Corinthians, God chose the foolish things of this world to shame the wise, the weak things to shame the strong, and I see that reflected in these humorous creatures. But I try to throw in a little bit of irony there, because they're heavy themes, but I hopefully people could also see the beauty in the composition amidst those weightier themes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, and
Oh my goodness.
this
Okay.
was the
Give us a
final
minute with
painting.
this one.
So this was the final concluding painting, which drew together all the 17 animal species from the series. So you'll see that they're all surrounding the lamb, and that's a historical symbol, the Lamb of God, for Christ. But I wanted to uh, really express this idea of cosmic redemption, that it's not just humans that can benefit uh, through from Christ's work on the cross, but it's also creation itself, and how they bring praise. And so they're all surrounding this slain lamb, and you see how, like, the brokenness, the blood, is bringing new life, because you see all of this vegetation growing up, all these flowers and new life amidst the barren, wintry landscape.
Years and years ago, when I was a new believer, there was a song that was quite popular. And when I first started painting and I didn't have enough skill, I was trying to represent that song um,
Okay.
with a crucifix and with the blood pouring down the crucifix and the flowers growing up from the ground beneath, because the name of
Okay.
the song was Love Grew Where the Blood Fell.
Oh, wow. I'm not
This
familiar
is
with them.
this is such a beautiful representation of that song. Much more beautiful concept than what I had tried to imagine, but
Hmm.
you really captured it. The
Thank,
lamb slain from the foundations of the world.
yes. Yeah, so it was inspired by Isaiah 53, which is a prophecy foretelling of the Jewish Messiah. And what was really interesting about it is that the moral innocence of the Messiah is likened to an innocent lamb. And I was really thinking about the moral innocence of animals. And this painting could be read from also an environmentalist perspective, an animal rights perspective, and that's certainly something I'm very passionate about. But for those who have eyes to see the meta narrative of the Christian story of creation, fall, redemption, I wanted to reflect on. For instance, like the passage of the wolf laying down with the lamb, and this picture where there will not be any more suffering that the natural world has experienced as a result of humanity's rebellion. And it was a call toward living out our reconciliation with creation, as well as with God, and how that will drive a greater respect and value for the earth that we've been called to steward.
Now, way up at the top, there's a
Yeah.
figure sitting on one of the, oh,
Oh, that's a barn owl.
that's okay.
Yes. Yes,
No,
you
no,
have.
no. I was
Oh,
looking at the
oh,
lower circle there. I can't tell if it's right or left for you, but for me, it's on
okay.
the right side of my screen in the right circle at the top.
Right circle at the top. Yes, that's the gibbon.
Oh, the gibbon. Okay.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
he's
When it was on my
it-
screen, all I could see were
yeah.
the feet, and I thought, oh, who's sitting up there?
Yeah, it was quite a challenge. I spent upwards of 1,700 hours working on this painting. It's 105 by 65 inches, so it's a great big massive painting. And it was a challenge to make sure, all the animals would be in proper proportion to one another. And even like on the graves in the background, I put the names of extinct species. So you have on the one right below the butterfly, to the left, you have dodo bird, and then you have a saber tooth, and there's lots of other names on the other tombstones to know that they're present there as well. So
Well, go back to the
yeah,
full picture because there's
yeah,
a couple things I want to point out here for viewers because
yes.
I'm getting ready to start a series on how the elements and principles of art and design kind of reveal themselves throughout every aspect of every domain of knowledge, every
Okay.
science and all of that. And so I'm trying to point out some of these principles. So one of the things that you have going on here is that you've been very, very careful with um, the balance of saturated and desaturated colors. So you have a dominance of desaturated color
Yes.
here. The background lavender and the grays and the browns are very neutral, semi-neutral in tone. And then right around the lamb slain, which is where you want people to focus, you've
Mhm.
brought in these vibrant saturated colors,
That's right.
right? So then you have a dominance of kind of lavenders and grays, and you have uh, a focal point of the complementary color around the butterfly is the yellow, the complement to
Mhm.
these blue violets.
Yes,
But
yeah.
then right in the center, you've got this vibrant red, which draws the eye right in, right? So
Yes.
you've got this whole thing going in the composition that's so beautifully managed. And there are many of the elements of
Thank
Mass
you.
House of Design that show up here. And you also have this almost like a golden spiral of the animals around the outside coming back in and then spiraling in to where the center is right where the lamp
Okay.
is.
Okay, that's an interesting comment. I didn't really think about that. There is it is very much a radial composition
Yeah.
where really the center of the painting is somewhere between the lamb and the monarch butterfly, but the butterfly is really the spark of life and
Mhm.
symbolic of metamorphosis and a new life. But yeah, those are insightful observations. Color is very important to drive um, where you want the eye to go in a painting, and also contrast. As you know, you see in the background, there's very little contrast. It's very muted, but then you see the striking difference between that bright red blood with the white wool of the lamb to really draw your eye to the central focus. And then, of course, with all the foliage and flowers around the throne. And I took inspiration from historical paintings like Jan van Eyck's The Adoration of the Lamb, which was part of this large altarpiece frame. And I like that Renaissance color palette of greens and reds. Um, and but I like, more modern painters like Caspar David Friedrich. His painting Winter Landscape is almost monochromatic, but it has one, lone figure in the snow. I really like the negative space that you need for a painting that has so much of a maximalist aesthetic in the center. You need a lot of breathing room with that, the snowy hills in the backdrop.
Yes, yes. And also, I mean, very obviously you've got all the animals looking in at the lamb, but for the but less obviously, you have ways to give the viewer a journey through the canvas that is connected to the value contrasts and the way that you've
Mhm.
used line and the way that you've used direction.
Yes,
Um,
leading lines
yeah,
perspective.
yep.
Yes, like you see how the 1 point perspective, which I often like to draw the viewer's eye to the center where it's hard to see this, but with my hands here, you see like the left hand and the right hand, all those lines are leading, even like, I'm trying to think, like even like the orca whale on the left, and even the narwhal on the right, they're pointing inward. And I think that's what, like you mentioned, draws the eye to
Well, and
the focal point.
it's an artist's little secret that you want to keep the viewer's eye from going off to the next painting.
Yeah, yeah,
And so what you've done is to on both the right and the left, you've got ways for the viewer to get back into the frame. And
yes,
at the bottom, you've got the elephant moving into the frame. So you
that's
all
right.
the way around, you've got ways to get back to the center. So
Yeah,
um yeah, beautifully composed. How
thank you.
long did the planning of this take?
So it took about a month to plan this painting, which is much longer than usual. But I was learning 3D modeling, and I wanted to make sure like these ruins would be in perspective, but also that the animals too would be proper proportion, because humpback whale is this massive creature. Even the narwhal in some ways dwarfs the cassowary bird, which is the one with the horn on top, and that's about 6 feet tall, human size. So it gives you a bit of a perspective of that. But I mean, the paintings are usually planned out years in advance through sketches and sketchbooks, and they develop slowly over time. And so that helps me develop I think the quality of the composition, because initially for many years I just had the center panel sketched and kind of a very rough idea, and I didn't have all the animals. But then I shared that idea with some family and friends, and they said, well, you have to include all the animals from the series. And so I then decided to develop it into a triptych, which is 3 panels that make up one painting. And you can see that there are hinges in between those outer 2 panels, which you can functionally close this painting like an altarpiece frame. And so I had to also design the frame as well. So it was definitely a labor of love and a lot of forethought that went into even before painting.
So when you start, I mean, when you first conceive of something like this, is the idea complete in your mind? I mean, not all the elements of it, but just the central idea. Here, I
Yes.
think the central idea is that you want to focus in on the lamb slain.
Yes.
Was
That
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 idea
was
complete before you started?
it was, but I mean, my concept sketches are in a tiny little 4 by 6 inch sketchbook. So in a
Mhm.
very like rudimentary form, I had some of the animals. I knew that there was going to be a lamb and some ruined Gothic cathedral in the background, and a lot of atmosphere in the backdrop. But then yeah, it develops over time slowly. I have an idea in my mind, like I have the colors and composition, but I need to take time to sit on the concept, read books. A book that was instrumental was the Animal Gospel by Andrew Lindsay, which I highly recommend people read. So and even like, for instance, you see that there's those elephant tusks on the altar, and that was, a reflection of ivory poaching. And so that was early on, I think, something that I had in mind. So there were some kind of foundational or core compositional motifs that I knew needed to be there. But then over time, like the full composition developed.
Just extraordinary. So we're probably not going to have time to do all of the work from the Vanitas and Veritas collection, but oh, here's your book, Streams in the Wasteland.
Yes. Yeah, for the rest of the paintings and stories, and also my brother, who's a composer, he created an original soundtrack to complement the book. So it's quite it was a fun project to work on during the pandemic, and multidisciplinary. So just wanted to mention that quickly.
So this is the painting I
Yeah,
particularly wanted to talk about.
great.
So maybe we could just touch on this one, and then maybe we could have another conversation in the
Right.
future where we go through the whole Vanitas and Veritas collection.
Okay, let me just see here. I think I thought I had the full painting. Yes. Here we go. Here's
Okay,
Swallowed
so
by
the
Knowledge.
swallowed by knowledge. Okay. Um, so I just want everybody to take a look at this for a second first and reflect on what you think it means and what you think the symbolic underpinning is of this painting. And I mean, one of the first things that springs to mind is when Jordan Peterson is always talking about that one of the archetypal pictures of how the world works is that we need to go into the belly of the whale and rescue our fallen father.
Mm,
And so when I see the belly of the whale, that's one of the first things that jumps to mind. And of course, at the same time, we get the picture of Jonah.
yes.
And there's something about thinking about tradition as being our fallen father. You know, we've lost the traditions of the past. And is there a way to um, not go back to the past, but to recapture the traditions of the past and bring them into our present day and in a meaningful way to help us get into the future, you know? So
Hmm.
I don't know if any of that resonates with what
Oh,
you're thinking of there, but
that's very interesting. I like that. I like that with painting that it can be very generative that way, where you can have unique reference points that add meaning and depth that I may have not seen. But what you shared was definitely complementary. I think it was very much a musing on knowledge and how in a modern society we have so many facts and figures, but we really lack a lot of wisdom. And so there's a lot of confusion in that regard, a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and bias politically on news platforms, etc. But yet, in my view, with this whole series, Vanitas and Veritas was about the nature of wisdom and what is wisdom, because it's not simply just accruing more knowledge, because we know that some of the smartest people in the world were evil eugenicists and diabolical dictators, people with PhDs. And I was thinking that this pursuit of knowledge can become a sort of idol where we think we're wise, but we're not. And I want to be careful because I'm not against academic study. I very much love reading. You'll see this in this painting. There's all these different books, from religion to philosophy to science to fiction and psychology. And there's a benefit to studying broadly, but when that becomes kind of our sole purpose, we can lack humility. And so I think there needs to be an intellectual humility. And he's reading actually a portion of the book of Ecclesiastes in the book that Colette, who is a character inspired by the book of Ecclesiastes, is sitting there, and there's a line at the end of the book of reading many books, there is no end. And this kind of idea that there can be a futility or vanity in the pursuit of knowledge. And that's the whole concept of being swallowed by knowledge. He's in the belly of the whale, but that the light, which is this lantern, this orb, is symbolic of divine revelation, which can illuminate all these academic disciplines to perceive the wisdom that can be gleaned, and that, you know, I believe the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, that we need a reverence and awe for something bigger outside of ourselves if we truly want to pursue wisdom.
the other verse that comes to mind is knowledge puffs up, but love builds up.
Hmm,
And knowledge is something we can
beautiful.
take in just by sitting and reading.
Yes.
Love is something that requires
Yes.
action. Uh,
That's that's right. Yeah. And even like uh loving your neighbor as yourself, if we were to apply that with all the culture wars that we're experiencing and talking past one another, um, we could respect people that come from a different vantage point, a different political persuasion, and that's really the foundation of good conversation and debate. And that's where that humility uh, comes from, which is based in love for the other, and seeing the dignity and value in another person. And like Jordan Peterson often says, when you sit down for a conversation with someone who disagrees with you on something, pretty major. If you go into it with the outlook that you can learn from them, it can be far more fruitful in that conversation. So yeah, that's definitely yeah, great verse that I think uh, reflects the themes in this painting that you shared.
Do you think
Yeah.
that you would have time in the future to do a follow-up on this so that we could go into more depth in this Vanitas and Veritas
Oh,
series?
sure. Yeah, I would
Because
be happy to talk further.
one of the things you talk about in your trailer is that Kolach is this character here in the black suit.
Yes.
And then you have Sophia, who is the woman in the series.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And yeah, I think it would be really fruitful to be able to give this enough time so that people could actually reflect on these things while we're talking.
Yeah, I would be happy to share further because it goes into a different direction than my streams in the Wasteland series, which is very much about these historic, cultural civilizations, whereas Vanitas and Veritas is more about the micro perspective of virtue and wisdom and living in a modern world. So it's definitely something I'd be happy to talk with you further about.
Well, great. Let's get something on the schedule. This has been so illuminating and just soul nourishing, I would have to say.
Oh, well,
And
thank
meeting
you.
you has been incredible, Josh. I mean, a man of your age to have imbibed so much wisdom and character development and insight and vision is just a remarkable testimony to your parents and probably to the suffering that your whole family has had to survive, but also a testament to God's work in you. And it gives me great hope for the future, really does.
Oh, thank you so much, Karen. I've really enjoyed this conversation and how real you've been with me and the great questions and it's a really thoughtful conversation. It's been a real blessing.
I will put all the information in the description section for those who are watching this, and we'll set something up for the future.
Okay.
Yeah, it's always best to come back in person before
Yeah, I
before we
realized
finish up. Yeah,
I was
yeah.
sharing. It's been pretty
So,
wild.
um, thank you again, and I look forward to the next time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Karen.
Okay, have a
Talk
great day.
again. Okay, bye.
Bye.